And in the past, I already went to many different physiotherapists and also tried a lot of things on my own, but nothing really seemed to lead to any lasting improvement. I can now train basically without any pain, and also the pain levels in my day-to-day life have already significantly decreased. Therefore, I really would like to say thank you so much to Connor and Trevor for making this possible.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another case study video. Today I'm really excited to share with you another client that got great results improving some left hip and right shoulder issues that we see associated with some of the common patterns of the human body. Adrian came to me as someone who likes to work out and be a really active guy, but he couldn't really do these things because he felt some impingement and tightness within his left hip whenever he would lift and move into deeper levels of hip flexion or hip bend, and also when he would go on long walks. He would feel like he couldn't do either of these things and was really limiting him from living the life he wanted to have. As you heard within his testimonial, Adrian had seen so many different physical therapists and nothing really seemed to stick, and he didn't really get the results he was looking for because, unfortunately, in my opinion, people tend to look at hip and shoulder issues as isolated events, and there are issues with the hip, there are issues with the shoulder, but depending on whether someone has left or right shoulder or hip pain, that can influence what's happening throughout the rest of the kinetic chain. And if we can appreciate some underlying asymmetrical influences on the human body, then we can understand how left and right issues are not quite the same in many cases. I'll link up above and down below in the description some more information on this pattern that we're going to be talking about, which is the left AIC. But to keep it brief, Adrian presented like this. In this pattern, we tend to be lateralized towards the right side of our body. We tend to be leaning on it more. There's a reason why most people are right-handed. And yes, even left-handed people have this underlying organ and brain asymmetry. So we tend to see a right hip that's higher and a right shoulder that's lower. The sacrum and sternum bones tend to be facing the right side. Because we're leaning on the right side, we're in a position of internal rotation on the right hip, external rotation on the left hip. So the left hip is more forward, the right hip is more rotated back. Now, we tend to have a slight counter rotation of the spine towards the left, but we still have the sacrum and also the sternum bone here, sacrum, sternum, facing relatively towards the right side. Now this results in a situation on the right side where the femur is rotated in, and on the left, the femur is rotated more out. And the shoulder, we tend to have more internally rotated right shoulder because this chest wall here is compressed and being pulled forward and down. And on the left side, we tend to have more of an externally rotated position of the rib cage. Now, what this results in on the back side is this shoulder on the right side being more winged out, this shoulder on the left side being more pulled back and compressed on the back rib cage. Adrian's also a pretty big guy who likes to lift weights heavy. So because of that, because lifting weights is inherently an extension-driven movement a lot of the times, the body's going to adapt to the imposed demands on it. And if he's constantly in this extended state, doing a lot of bench press, squats, deadlifts, etc., his body's probably going to be in that extended state. So what ends up happening is he has a pelvis that's forward on both sides, but more so on the left, and his ribs are going to be flared up. But again, because the right shoulder is more forward, the ribs on the left side tend to be more flared. This left hip pinch became very apparent, especially when we brought him into hip flexion on his left side. As you can see, once I brought him to right about here, he started to feel that pinch and it was pretty uncomfortable. Because if we're forward on both sides and externally rotated, but more forward on the left, you can see that that's going to close off the space in the front right here. We're not going to have a whole lot of space to rotate back. So as I bring that leg into hip flexion, I bring it back more and more and more, I'm going to run into the rim of the acetabulum right here. So he's going to feel that pinching sensation. And that's not very great because a lot of lifts, like deadlifts and squats, require you to move into hip flexion. Also, this can cause issues when walking, and it makes sense why he felt this after long walks. Because when I need to shift into my left side, my femur needs to rotate back in my hip, but he can't do that very well. So he can't really shift into his left hip genuinely, and then he can't push out of it very well either because that femur doesn't have a lot of space to move within the hip socket. So he's basically wearing down the hip rim in a lot of the activities that he was doing. His Ober's test was failed on both sides, which represents how neutral his pelvis is. If I can bring the leg all the way up and around and drop it down, that's an internally rotated position of the hip. And obviously he wasn't able to do that on either side because he is forward and externally rotated on both sides. The left side was worse, as we would expect, because in order for you to do that Ober's test, you need to be able to bring that leg up, around, and then drop it down into internal rotation. And this pelvis also needs to move into internal rotation as well to accommodate for that. Hip rotation was limited, but it wasn't terrible. However, on the left side, he did feel that pinch in his hip when we brought him into hip flexion and then tried to internally rotate him. He didn't have the space to move into that, so he felt that pinch. His right external rotation was more limited than his left, which would make sense because within this left AIC pattern, if we're forward, we're more internally rotated on the right, more externally rotated on the left. So the right femur is going to have less external rotation available to it, more relative internal rotation. And also a straight leg raise, which is a measurement of how much internal rotation his pelvis can access, was more limited on the left side. His hip abduction, which is a measurement of external rotation, was more limited on the right because in order for you to move into hip abduction, you have to roll this femur forward and then move it up like that. So we would expect there to be better hip abduction on the left side. When it came to his upper body, he had more of a limitation in his right shoulder internal rotation relative to his left. This is because shoulder internal rotation is a representation of how much tightness is on the front side of your rib cage. If this is really compressed and pulling you down, you're not going to have a lot of space to rotate back. But if this was open more so, now your humerus is in a better position to internally rotate. His left shoulder external rotation was also more limited, because this is a representation of how much tightness is on the back side of his rib cage. If you pin your shoulder blade back and try to move back into external rotation, it doesn't feel very good. So basically the left side has the inverse problem of the right side. It's too compressed in the back, which is limiting this movement. Also, this represents him being turned towards the right side, because if he has better right shoulder external rotation and left shoulder internal rotation, do you see what that does to his rib cage? This is a representation of how he's laying on the table. This is also true of his pelvis. If I have better internal rotation and hip adduction, like in that Ober's test on the right side relative to the left, that means I can shift this way more so on the right. On the left side, better hip abduction, boom, pushing away from that side. This is representing what's happening at his pelvis. So this is what's happening at his pelvis. He's shifted over to the right side. The other important thing I did was look at his foot arches. And he had relatively high foot arches on both sides, but he did not have the ability to pronate effectively on either side. So as someone who was externally rotated within his hips, he was also externally rotated at his feet. Now, when I looked at his pronation, he basically pushed his knee over his toe and there was no movement happening within his foot arch whatsoever. So that tells me that he doesn't have the ability to internally rotate and pronate at his foot, just like he doesn't have the ability to internally rotate at his hip. He was actually more so limited in his ability to pronate on the right side. And this tells me, I know this is a left foot model, but bear with me, that he's unable to flatten that arch out and push out of his right side back into his left side. This is very common within the left AIC pattern. We tend to see a higher foot arch on the right side because we are leaning over to that side. So the left foot arch tends to be lower, right tends to be higher. Within my biomechanics course, I have a 3-phase progression model. And what we need to do first is we need to bring him back on both sides. That's also going to bring his femur into more of a neutral state on the left side so that he can start to get that femur to work better within his hip socket. Now, one thing we did initially, because I could tell that he was not wearing great shoes to support those arches, especially on the right side, was I put a little arch pad underneath his right foot arch in the sole of his shoe. The reason why I only did it on the right side is because it's sort of like you're standing on a hill. If you're on a decline hill, then you're going to reflexively lean back to balance yourself out, right? But if you're on a hill that's slanted, then you're going to lean towards the other side to even yourself out. So for Adrian, that right foot arch wedge helped push him right, but that helped him reflexively lean back over to the left. And that was really helpful. It actually immediately took away a lot of the pinching within his hip after he walked for just a couple of steps after that. The first thing we did was put him in a 90-90 position, and we worked on getting his hamstrings to recruit one side at a time as we pulled his pelvis back on that side. We also added a reach with a balloon that allowed him to get his abs on, because his obliques and his hamstrings are going to help because they contract here and down here, pull the pelvis back on that side. And then we're gonna do it on both sides. So we did this activity on both sides. He started with his right foot on the wall, ended with his left foot on the wall, because ultimately we want him to come back on both sides, but end up going to the left. So that balloon was really important, especially the reach across the body, because as we noticed earlier, he's very stiff and he didn't have the ability to rotate. People who lack the ability to rotate have stiff backs. So by getting the full exhale, we took him from a position like this, brought his rib cage down, and get him to stack his ribs over his hips more, and that will also help him get his obliques and hamstring on more effectively. From there, we put him in a quadruped position, but with a little bit of elevation underneath his left hand, because remember, in this left AIC, right PC pattern, they're more forward on the right side, more compressed in the right rib cage, and they're more compressed in the back left rib cage. So we're sort of like this. Now, by putting him in the quadruped position, but elevating the left hand, that's going to push his ribs back more so on the left side. What that's going to do is, if you can look at me right here, I push my ribs slightly back. That's going to open up that space between my spine and my scapula, because I'm going to be reaching, but I'm going to be turning my spine more so to the left, which is going to decompress this area. What that's also going to do, because of this turn right here, is I'm going to close off the right side more so, because these spinous processes are turning towards the right. That's actually going to help me open up my right anterior rib cage. So I'm getting right anterior rib cage expansion, left posterior expansion. That's exactly what he needed. Those two exercises alone put him in a really good position. So what ended up happening was he got full mobility of his internal and external rotation back on both sides, and that's huge. Within his pelvis, his hip pinching was completely gone. Once I open up space of range of motion within the shoulder, especially on the right side, what I then want to do is get the muscles to work to help bring the shoulder into a better resting position within the rib cage. I start with the rib cage, then I reorient the scapula on the rib cage. So on the right side here, what we want to facilitate is the low trap muscle and the long head of the tricep, which attaches on the lateral border here. The low trap and the tricep here are gonna pull the right shoulder, because remember, it's usually winged and out like this more so. It's gonna help pull it back more so on the rib cage. And that's going to allow it to start in relatively more of this downwardly rotated and externally rotated position. We did that with a seated banded resisted activity, where he was basically leaning to the left side and extending his right arm to feel that low trap and tricep. That's also going to help him open up that right rib cage even more and hold on to that adaptation. Now within lifting, we basically just needed to pattern really basic stacking mechanics. I start here with almost everyone, because a lot of people come in with a lot of bad habits. So I need them to learn how to keep their ribs stacked over their pelvis and be able to move with load in that position, which feels very foreign to most people. They actually usually feel pretty crazy doing it, honestly, but I'll take a picture of them and show them what they look like afterwards, and they're like, oh yeah, I actually look really good. Just to me, it feels really weird. So usually a cable zercher position, going to a box, keeping him out of deep hip flexion for now because of that hip, keeping him where he can actually move genuinely was really important. So we had him do that cable position because that allows him to reach those ribs back, keep a neutral pelvis, and still move through a nice vertical squat pattern. At this point, the biggest thing was he was still feeling a little bit of left hip tightness when he would go on walks of around 12 to 18,000 steps, which is a lot of steps. And that's understandable given that it had only been a week. So I still think he needed a little bit more space within that left hip, specifically the ability to shift that left hip back into the posterior hip capsule. So we gave him something to really open up that back left hip, but not only that, get an overhead reach on the right side to really open up those right ribs, just like we know he needs. So we got a little bit of bang for our buck in that exercise. And then now that he had even more internal rotation space on the left, we wanted to integrate the ability for him to really have the muscles control the femur gliding back within the hip. When we move into mid stance on one side, the adductor, the hamstring, and the oblique, but especially the forward fibers of the glute med muscle help secure that femur rotating back within the hip socket. Similar to getting the rib cage first for the shoulder and then integrating the muscles to help get the scap in a better position and maintain it in a better position. Within the pelvis, we want to open up space and then educate better movement into that space and the ability for the femur to glide within the hip socket. So here he's pushing into that box and then controlling that internal rotation, really focusing on feeling that hamstring and his glute med as well as his obliques. We also progressed his lifting. So we started off in a position where it's easy for him to shift into his left hip. That'd be a left hip forward, right hip back activity on the wall. This is because when that left hip is forward, it's starting in an externally rotated position. But as we shift into that and load it, we move into internal rotation. And we'll progress from there. But that's usually a pretty easy place to start for people when we start to add more load. So he always had an offset load, meaning that he always had a heavier weight in his right hand, because we naturally shift away from heavier loads. And that means that if I have a weight in my right hand, I'm gonna shift left, regardless of whether my right or left foot is forward. The difference in cueing I had him focus on here is when his left hip was forward, I was having him focus on his left heel and really getting his hip outside of his knee, so that way he could open up that posterior capsule. On the right side, when the right hip was forward and the left hip was back, I had him focus on that right arch cue, because we want to integrate the pronation and footwork we're doing with the glute max, because the right glute max helps push him out of his right side. So it's more so we're focusing on the ability to get external rotation on the right side and more internal rotation on the left side. We also had him move into a Hatfield squat rather than the Zercher squat, because we were progressing how much hip flexion he was going into. But at this point, we were ready for him to move into heavier loads. We also ramped up his deadlift intensity, having him lift heavier and heavier. Now, at the third week, we started to focus on more upright integration. So a goal for people that I know like to walk and also run long distances is I like to get them shifted over into left stance and have them focus on those muscles without much external reference. So I had them shift left and focus on the glute med, adductor, and oblique and stay in left stance, and shift those arms as if he's moving through mid stance, really focusing on the rotation, but he needs to be able to feel those muscles. And if he ever loses them or his back kicks on or anything like that happens, he needs to end the set. And the goal for him was to start at 30 seconds, but be able to do that consistently for 2 minutes. This is the ultimate upright integration. He was able to get to that 2 minutes pretty quickly, and he was able to go on walks without any issues. He was feeling pretty good throughout his entire daily life as well, as you heard in that testimonial. His right shoulder was still great, hadn't really given him any issues whatsoever since we started. And also, that right foot arch wedge, I wanted him to start to take it out, because we're working on the right foot. The pronation was improving, as you can see, and we're starting to see more movement within that foot. So I don't want to use that arch wedge as a crutch forever. It's just there temporarily to help him be able to shift left more. But now he can. So I want to start to take these things out, take away these constraints, and allow him to just live the life that he wants in the way he wants without having to use a bunch of extra stuff to help him do that. And we also focused on a staggered stance deadlift, because now if I start with the left hip back and we still have that right hand load with the toe elevation, which biases a lot of internal rotation, now he's starting in internal rotation, having to move into more as he goes deep into it. So this is something he definitely wouldn't have been able to do the first day, but as he gets access to more internal rotation range, I can start to push him deeper and deeper into that. Because you stuck around to the end of this case study, I know that you might have more interest in learning more. If you want to learn more, I do have my beginner biomechanics course for people who have less of a familiarity with basic anatomy and biomechanics. And I also have my self-paced biomechanics course. You can get 15% off either of those or both with the code CASESTUDY15, which I'll link down below in the description.